The arrogance that some of these NFL GMs have is insane. The draft obviously isn't solved, and no one is that good at it, but there is a ton of data out there that should be informing decisions made on draft day that tons of teams are just choosing to simply ignore because they think they're smarter than the data. Allow me to introduce you to the consensus board. If you're not already familiar, it's basically just an aggregation of the draftable player rankings from all of the analysts out there who publish their boards. So why is this important? Well, it stems from the scientific phenomenon called the wisdom of the crowd. It basically says that when you take the educated, independent opinions of a wide variety of experts and combine them, you get some remarkably intelligent and accurate insights. And studies from entities like PFF, Football Outsiders, Over the Cap, and Arif Hassan's Wide Left have confirmed that this applies to the consensus board. What we've learned is that reaching on a player and taking him significantly earlier than his consensus ranking, on average, results in significantly worse outcomes, meaning the player just ends up not being that good compared to where he was drafted. And also that steals, i.e. taking a player significantly later than his consensus ranking, result in better than normal outcomes. However, the data says getting a steal is only like a little bit better than the normal outcome, whereas reaching is way worse than the normal outcome. The best explanation that I could think of for this disparity is that it only takes one team to reach, whereas to create a steal, it takes a ton of teams passing on the player, meaning that there was likely data out there on the player that the consensus board wasn't aware of. So should NFL teams just be taking whatever player is highest on the consensus board every time they pick? Well, no, because there is a ton of data out there that NFL teams have access to that the consensus board doesn't, like medical evaluations, player character concerns, and other off-the-field stuff. In fact, PFF did a study comparing the results of the NFL draft against the pure consensus board using PFF WAR and determined that the NFL is in fact slightly better drafting than the consensus board. However, they agreed that the consensus board should serve as a check. If you're about to draft a guy at 30 who's 90th on the consensus board, that means it's probably a really bad idea. When a team thinks that they're smarter than the wisdom of the crowd, they're usually wrong. And that leads me back to this graph that Warren Sharp put together. It basically tells you how much each team reached and stole in the 2026 draft. Up and to the left means that you were stealing more, down and to the right means that you were reaching more. And so now we can see exactly which teams think they're smarter than everyone else. And the team that sticks out like a sore thumb is the 49ers. And you might say, well, the 49ers are a really good team. Clearly they know what they're doing. I'm not so sure about that. Look at their last 5 drafts and you'll see maybe 3 starting level players. They have been catastrophically bad at drafting in the last few years, and that's because every year they pretty much lead the league in reaches. Now, there are other good teams down here too, like the Rams, but they're more of a one-off. They typically don't reach very often and are normally on the other side of the spectrum. I thought it was also really interesting to see that there were a lot of historically not very good teams at the top of this graph, indicating that they are following the wisdom of the crowds. At first glance, that makes me think, well, if these bad teams are following these supposedly good principles and they're still bad, maybe that means the principles themselves are bad. However, if you look at data for prior years, you'll see that most of these teams reached more in the past, and the shift only really occurred in the last year or two. To me, that says that these teams realized that they were bad and that their draft process wasn't working and decided to look at the data and reevaluate and go with what the data says they should be doing. And I think that could also explain why we have some good teams down here. They think, oh, we're a good team, we're drafting well, we don't need to reevaluate and look at what the data says we should be doing differently.